Last week, Hurricane Milton battered Florida with storm surge, Category 3 wind speeds, widespread flooding, and tornadoes. This came just on the heels of Hurricane Helene, which caused widespread destruction and death across the Southeast. As our world faces extreme weather events that no one has seen in their lifetime, a small but vocal online community of conspiracy theorists have perpetuated dangerous false information about cloud seeding and weather modification. Some have even speculated that these hurricanes have been caused by the government. This week, we're going off the radar to address those conspiracy theories. I'll be chatting with scientists who have built their life's work around studying and attempting to modify hurricanes, not to cause harm, as some might think, but to prevent destruction and save lives. We'll dive into the history of weather modification.
In the 50s, they tried seeding the hurricane, actually with dry ice.
And why they say messing with Mother Nature is an incredibly complex issue.
The power of hurricane is equivalent to the power of all the power plant of the world combined. Nothing can work to modify hurricane.
I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the oceans, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do.
Let your imagination soar with Audible. With stories across every genre, from expert advice to fantasy, you'll be inspired to imagine new worlds, possibilities, and ways of thinking. Listening can even lead to a positive change in your mood, habits, and overall well-being. As an Audible member, you'll get to choose one title a month to keep from their entire catalog, including bestsellers and new releases. Allow yourself to delve into the spooky this season by listening to classics like Stephen King's The Shining and Pet Sematary. There's more to imagine when you listen. New members can try Audible free for 30 days. Visit audible.com/imagine or text imagine to 500-500. That's audible.com/imagine or text imagine to 500-500.
Welcome to Off the Radar. I'm Emily Gracie. If you've been following the show for a while, you may have heard our episode where we previously discussed cloud seeding, a type of weather modification that uses substances like silver iodide to essentially make it rain. We did a whole episode about how this method was used during the Vietnam War in an attempt to wash out the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And take a listen. It's called Weaponizing Weather. Today, in light of this trending topic of hurricane engineering, we're continuing the discussion. On the show today, we have Dr. Hugh Willoughby. Dr. Willoughby was the chief scientist on Project Storm Fury, NOAA's only attempt at hurricane modification. He spent 25 years working with NOAA's Hurricane Research Division, including 7 years as the director of that division. Dr. Willoughby has studied hurricane dynamics and flown on over 400 reconnaissance flights into hurricanes and typhoons on missions like those that we recently covered in our Hurricane Hunters episode last week. I'll also be talking to Moshe Alamaro, a retired MIT atmospheric scientist who spent much of his career trying to learn whether we could control the natural forces of hurricanes so that they're not as destructive, only to realize that the technical, political, and ethical issues of hurricane modification made the work nearly impossible to put into practice. But first up, I'm going to check in with my friend and TV meteorologist Ed Piotrowski to discuss some of the wild comments he's gotten from viewers asking about weather modification in the wake of these recent hurricanes. So, Ed, let's talk about this week and what's been going on here, because Helene happened not too long ago. Disaster in North Carolina. This has been a mess. This is awful. And now, as we're recording this right now, Milton is making landfall tonight. So let's talk about some weather conspiracy theories that have been going on when it comes to this. I'm curious because you posted something on Facebook about this. Can you tell me, first of all, what you wrote? And then I want to hear about what viewers were saying in response to that.
Sure. I simply posted because of so many rumors that were circulating that hurricanes could not be controlled by man. In other words, we can't control their strength. We cannot control their motion. And I thought that was a pretty safe post to make just to quell the rumors. But unfortunately, the conspiracy theorists came out of the woodworks talking about how the government is controlling the weather and they're aiming for a certain group of people that the hurricanes are going to go to, which is all nonsense. As we all know, there have been times where NOAA has tried to do some work on reducing the impacts from hurricanes, but they've blatantly said and openly said that none of it has ever worked. So it's just about prepping for those.
What are some of the things that people have said in response to this, and where are they getting their information?
There's a lot of bad actors on the internet. And as we both know, there's money to be made on the internet, especially on social media. So I think a lot of these people literally just make stuff up so that the fear mongering causes the information to spread. And when that happens, they're getting a lot of interaction. But there's also a lot of conspiracy theories out there where people are just, quite frankly, misinformed. As you have heard quite a bit, people will throw patents in your face, that a patent is proof that this is actually happening. When in reality, what a patent is basically to protect you from anybody else using your invention or trying to duplicate your invention. There is absolutely nothing in a patent that says that it actually works. There's no proof of that at all. But people want to hear what they want to hear, no matter how many facts you throw in their face. They just don't want to believe that they could be wrong.
Right. And to be clear, I don't think anybody's denying that weather modification has existed in the past, but, that this is not something that there's so many things wrong with these theories. Like, why would you test out any sort of hurricane modification on a major landfalling hurricane? Like, why test something and then why make something worse? But, I get it a little bit too, in the way that something awful happened. People want answers. And in an absence of, being able to figure out the why, they look to whatever's available as far as information, whatever is readily available. And there's a lot readily available on the internet.
I mean, how many times did we hear we've never seen anything like Helene, or we've never seen anything like Milton, when there's clearly history that shows those kind of events, a hurricane turning back to the northwest or a hurricane crossing the Gulf of Mexico does happen. And it has happened in the past. It's just a rare event. People have short-term memories, or quite frankly, weren't alive when some of these things actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I was going to do an episode on Asheville and everything that's gone on in Asheville, and I'm putting that off, but I wanted to kind of bump that back a week and give it a little time to breathe and address this weather modification situation that's been in the buzz right now. So on today's show, I'm going to talk to two very interesting people. I'm sure you've heard of Project Storm Fury. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was kind of the government's attempt to modify hurricanes. And as you know, and as I know, it was not successful and still is not successful. But I am talking today to the chief scientist from that project, from Project Storm Fury. His name is Dr. Hugh Willoughby. Very interesting guy. And then I'm also going to talk to a professor named Moshe Alamaro. And he's an MIT researcher, retired now, but spent most of his career trying to modify hurricanes. Lots of different really wild things that are going to, make people say like, oh my gosh, that could work. But it didn't, I guess. It did not. I mean, obviously, we're still dealing with landfalling hurricanes, so there has not been success with this. Right. But, it's definitely something we need to talk about, because the less we talk about it, the more people think that there's something to hide. So I think it's important to bring it to the forefront. But is there anything else you want to share about landfalling hurricanes and kind of the lessons learned here from this year so far and moving forward?
It's just, I think the most important thing that people need to remember is to have really credible sources. Make sure that the person you're getting information from is a meteorologist or a scientist that studies the atmosphere. To me, that's the most important thing, because a lot of these things that are circulating are from random people on the internet. There's a big TikTok video going around right now that the Gulf Stream is going to pull Milton due north and wreck the east coast of the United States. And people just don't have enough scientific knowledge to realize that that's just not going to happen. So it casts doubt on our forecast. And then, of course, as we all know, when there's uncertainty or confusion about what the forecast is, a lot of bad decisions can be made. And unfortunately, people die when they make bad decisions on bad information. So I think just make sure you have credible sources when it comes to that. And don't buy into all the conspiracy theories. Make sure you listen to scientists who actually study this for a living.
Right. It's funny because in times like these, and we often talk about the role of local TV meteorologists and, people watching TV less and less, but I always point people to a TV meteorologist to follow on Facebook or Instagram or wherever you get your weather information, because that is your credible source. Your local meteorologist is going to know what's best for your area. So
absolutely.
Times like this, people like you are an incredibly important source. So thank you for all you do, Ed.
Well, thank you for what you do. I think one of the funniest things is the contradiction sometimes with these conspiracies. There are people that absolutely don't believe that man has anything to do with climate change, yet fully believe that man is impacting hurricanes and where they go. So you just kind of think sometimes about what's being said and doesn't even make sense,
Right. And we're going to learn about kind of hurricane dynamics today, too, and exactly what it would take to steer a hurricane or dissipate a hurricane or make a hurricane worse,
I can't wait to hear it. When you talk to Hugh Willoughby, tell him I said hello. I interviewed him in the Bahamas in the mid-90s. He's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met in my life. So
he's one of the original hurricane hunters. I mean, he used to fly into typhoons.
He knows what he's talking about.
Yeah. Awesome. Ed, thank you so much. And happy anniversary to you and Cindy. You've got to be nuts. I can't believe that she agreed to marry you during hurricane season, knowing
I know. I'll tell you the story behind that. We got married the day after Matthew, and I didn't even think I was going to make my wedding, but amazing story.
At least she knew what she was getting into from day one.
That's true. Divine intervention that I was able to make it for sure.
Ed, thanks so much. Next up, I'm talking with Hugh Willoughby, a research professor at Florida Atlantic University. He has spent more than 50 years studying the dynamics of hurricane motion, structural evolution, and intensity change. Dr. Willoughby is no stranger to discussions about weather modification.
Okay, it's kind of my punishment for having killed Project Storm Fury. I get charming interviews like yours, but I also get a lot of A, ignorant, and B, well, why can't we make hurricanes go away?
So one thing I hear kind of some misinformation about is what actually qualifies as weather modification. So can you give me kind of the basics on what weather modification actually is?
It started with rainmaking in the 40s. They dusted clouds with silver iodide, and it's sort of complicated, but they believed in the 40s that all rain began as ice crystals in clouds that extended above the freezing level and then melted when it fell down towards the ground. And by encouraging that to happen at a lower altitude in the clouds, it could make it rain. Irving Langmuir, the Nobel Prize-winning physical chemist, was a big advocate of this process. He kind of went off the deep end. He was a real serious guy, but this was kind of his blind spot. In the 50s, they tried seeding the hurricane with dry ice. And they thought it was going to head out to sea. It was off the Florida and Georgia coast. It turned around and hit Florida and Georgia, mostly Georgia. And the people there were very unhappy about that. In the 60s, Project Storm Fury started. And the idea was you'd seed around the eye, stimulate the clouds to grow, and form a new eye wall encircling the old one. And that would then contract and strangle the old eye wall. And while it was strangling the old eye wall, the winds would be reduced. And they tried that in 4 different hurricanes. I was at the Naval Postgraduate School getting my training as a naval meteorologist when Hurricane Camille hit the Gulf Coast. But at the same time, they were seeding Hurricane Debbie. And so they were looking for volunteers. And simple soul that I am, yeah, sign me up. They were looking for people with more education than experience or judgment, maybe. And that, I fit the bill. So I flew typhoon reconnaissance in the Pacific, taught for 3 years at the Naval Academy, and got out and came to the University of Miami with the idea of working for the Hurricane Research Division, which had one of its missions, Project Storm Fury, this hurricane modification effort. Before I got there, they seeded 3 different hurricanes. The most recent one in Debbie in 1969, they thought they'd weakened the hurricane artificially. There were people who were really nervous about cloud seeding, so we studied unmodified hurricanes. And what we found was there was a lot of natural ice down to just about to the freezing level, so cloud seeding wouldn't have much room to work. They also, unmodified hurricanes, form an outer eye wall, and it contracts around the inner one, and the inner one falls apart. And no intervention by humans.
So what people would hear now as an eye wall replacement cycle is what was happening there.
Right. And I wrote the papers that introduced that concept. People had seen concentric eye walls, but they didn't put the pieces together. And I wrote the Project Storm Fury paper that caused the project to its demise.
So I have a question. If you were in the Navy during Vietnam, wasn't there a weather modification project that was happening during Vietnam?
Yes.
It's the Ho Chi Minh Trail one, right?
Yeah, there was a seeding over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and it had some sort of a code name.
Operation Popeye.
Yes. I think we were doing I was there after they pulled the plug on Project Popeye. But the idea was to make it rain on the Ho Chi Minh Trail so that the North Vietnamese couldn't infiltrate to South Vietnam. It rained an awful lot anyway, and the North Vietnamese were used to it. They might have made it rain 10% more, but 10% more doesn't mean much when you're walking along with, carrying 2 artillery shells wearing black pajamas.
I mean, there have been some successes in using cloud seeding, right? Like I have seen even now in Texas, drought-stricken portions of Texas, where they're cloud seeding crops to basically make it rain to deal with drought. So is there a place for it, or is it always going to be controversial?
The real fallacy is you can't create water by cloud seeding. If there's not enough water, and the atmospheric conditions don't favor rain, you're not going to make it rain. I've considered writing a science fiction novel. You could actually use hurricanes that really did eye wall replacements just at the crucial time. You could claim that there were, these heroic hurricane flyers going out and keeping the hurricanes from happening and destroying coastal cities. And you could use the actual hurricanes that made concentric eye walls. You could just interpret the results differently.
But so I feel like you would make a lot of money if you did that. But then also, people would not see that as science fiction. They would see that as science fact, and they would run with it.
Let me give you an example of a weather modification thing that has a hope of working. Okay?
Okay.
The Gulf Stream goes through the Straits of Florida between Florida and Cuba, and then flows northward between Florida and the Bahamas. You could create structures in the Gulf Stream. And this isn't a serious proposal, right? This is just kind of playing around with it. You would make square ducts 140 meters long, and they'd be kind of trapezoidal shaped with the slope so that when with normal operation, when there wasn't a hurricane that you wanted to weaken, they would be down 100 meters in the ocean. There would be basically 100 of them in a row across the Gulf Stream. Okay, you have the picture?
Yeah.
And there'd be 3 or 4 rows.
Okay.
When you wanted to weaken a hurricane, as they were approaching Miami or Fort Lauderdale, you would tip them up to a 45-degree angle. Cool water would go in the bottom and out the top. And you would use that to cool off the Gulf Stream, which would cut off the supply of energy to the hurricane. Okay, how is this going to be a technology gone wrong? Well, they get this thing all set, right? So they turn it up, turn it on, and suddenly they do this in June. And suddenly the climate of Florida, which is steamy and miserable, becomes sort of like the climate of California. Not 100%, but, in June, July, and August, it's like April. Oh, that's good for the tourist industry. So, well, let's just leave these things turned up. It will rain less. That's too bad. But, the tourist industry is more important than agriculture. And then it messes up the ocean circulation and triggers an ice age.
So it's the butterfly effect. Even if you modify something for the better, something bad could happen too. And also, not to mention the fact that all, the hurricanes that are coming from the Gulf of Mexico right now too. So you've got a Florida filled with tourists and, hurricanes coming from the other direction.
There was a serious project. Some marine engineers from a nameless European country talked about putting wave-powered pumps to bring cold water up from below and cool off the ocean and make hurricanes less severe. Where do you think the rain that irrigates soybeans and corn and wheat in the heartland of the U.S., where does that evaporate from? Right where they were planning to make it cool. And you make it cool, there's not much, you could start a new Dust Bowl. There are real problems with unintended consequences.
There's a lot of ethical dilemmas that have been brought up because of this. Do you think that the science community should have more ethical training?
Medical research, there's some pretty careful ethical controls. Actually, the statistical schemes we use to evaluate a cloud seeding experiment, we actually hired a medical statistician to actually do the statistics. So I had a chance to talk to him some. If your experimental treatment really has a profound effect, you stop the double-blind experiment and give everybody the treatment. The medical people have thought pretty carefully about it, and most of them are motivated by desire to help people.
Talk to me about the government, because right now people think that there's secret government operations going on when it comes to weather modification. And they often bring up Project Storm Fury as it's been going on since the 60s. The government's been trying to control the weather. Can you speak to what is going on now when it comes to weather modification, and in particular, Hurricane Helene and the impact that it had in especially areas inland?
In a word, nothing. No, there's no enthusiasm whatsoever, at least in NOAA, for cloud seeding. We all wanted it to succeed. We worked at it, and as we got more into the science, it looked less and less favorable. And people are not going to devote their scientific careers to something that isn't going to have any results. If you cause something like what Helene did in the western North Carolina, it wouldn't be good for your career, but you wouldn't want to hurt all those people, simply from ethical point of view.
Do you think too much emphasis is being put on trying to modify weather as opposed to kind of hitting things at their source when we're talking about the warm Gulf waters and climate change and, carbon emissions? Nobody seems to be really looking at this from the source of the Gulf waters being so warm. Instead, it seems to be, let's put a Band-Aid on what's already happening.
You sort of bring this up at the appropriate time. About an hour before the email, I and my two co-authors are publishing a paper in the Journal of Applied Meteorology and Climatology that was just accepted. I got the accepted notice literally at noon today.
Congratulations.
Let me give you the what's happening with scientifically. We know that a warmer ocean produces more evaporation. And since the 1950s, Benner Miller, who was what we would now call the Science and Operations Officer at the National Hurricane Center, showed that a warmer ocean produces a lower pressure. Effect of a warmer ocean is well established, but there have been a series of papers that say what you will about this theoretical stuff, the damage is increasing. Well, this paper that's just been accepted says, well, yes, it does increase. And we make three different kinds of statistical arguments, which I think are very persuasive. So we really do need to start managing emissions. Now, what I think is true, the whole electric cars, renewable sources of electricity, solar, wind, etc. It takes about 80 years for a technology to evolve. And we're really in a race between these renewable sources and improved battery technology and global warming. And if we are right on the verge of it being more attractive to power utilities to use renewable sources than fossil fuels. But they tend to make economic decisions rather than environmental decisions. But as the economic decisions become so compelling, it's so much cheaper to switch to renewable sources, then we've got a chance.
Moshe Alamaro is a retired research scientist from MIT, where he received his master's of atmospheric science. Moshe spent years initiating programs with the hope of modifying hurricanes.
So I wrote a thesis at MIT on the physics of a hurricane. I built a lab where we built, managed, and operated a lab where we simulated hurricane. And we tried different, thought experiment, different approaches to address the hurricane, perhaps to reduce its intensity or to divert it from its track.
His first idea stemmed from the work that was being done by the government with Project Storm Fury.
The idea was in Storm Fury is to seed in the water drop in the hurricane with a material which enhance nucleation, enhance the freezing of the drop. Now, when a material is coming in contact with water drop, and that nucleation material, it enhances the freezing of the drop. But then the drop itself has a property to crystallize and to seed other drop. And then there is an avalanche, drop and drop and drop. And then once you start with that, it's going and going and going. So the material that they used was, liquid CO2. The best material, as I said, it's ice itself. So what we wanted is to take airplane with container and to fly very high when it's very cold, and the water in the container would freeze. And then we will use it to nucleate the drop in the cloud. Robert Simpson, I communicated with him, and he said that the hurricane contained ice. So if we had ice, nothing happened.
So that project was not going to work with hurricanes, but he found another use for the technology.
But then I developed this for another project where I use snowmaking equipment to create artificial snow, to create mountain of artificial snow, and to use the snow for water storage the water would be pumped from nearby storage where it's full in the winter, will create huge pile nearby. And then in the summer, the water would melt slowly and will go back to the reservoir. And in addition, those piles of snow can be used for year-round ski facilities.
His next idea involved gathering old jet engines to create an artificial updraft.
And then there was a Soviet literature in the 60s where they took jet engine mounted vertical, and they were successful in creating updraft of air that is going upward. And they used it to try to do weather modification with this.
Okay, so if you're like me, your first thought is, what does this look like?
It's a retired jet engine, and there are thousands of them around, and they are very inexpensive. And they're not expensive because they're not flight worthy. So the idea is to direct them upward, to put them vertical. And then the jet, it's called free jet. The jet has a property that when it go up, air is entrained in the air that's going up. So the amount of air that is going up increasing, but air is entrained in the air, which is entrained, and then eventually you have huge amount of air that going up. And that is a condition for rainfall. When water vapor go up, the water vapor reach air layer, which is very cold, and then the water vapor freeze, and then you have rain. Now it sounds really stupid. The idea was to take jet engine mounted on large ship and then to create artificial small hurricane which will take energy from the ocean, depriving the energy for the real hurricane that would come later.
And once again, Moshe thought, okay, this didn't work for hurricanes, but maybe it has another use. Well, one way a bunch of rising air would be useful is in a situation where sinking air is causing reduced visibility and poor air quality.
So it didn't work for hurricane. And then we tried to use it to enhance rain, which was not enough air going up. And then I tried to develop a complete concept to address smog condition. And I proposed this to India and China, but then it died out because of the COVID. So we couldn't continue with this.
It didn't stop with jet engines. Listen to this one.
And the idea was to spread black carbon on the top of hurricane. And the black carbon absorbs sun radiation, and in that way would affect the hurricane physics somehow.
But after years of research, Moshe came to a conclusion.
Nothing can work to modify hurricane because the public perception and the technical challenge, the power of hurricane is equivalent to the power of all the power plant of the world combined. Can you imagine? The problem is the control experiments are difficult or impossible. Control experiments say you want to experiment some drug on some patients. So you take, 1,000 patients, and then you give to some placebo and some real of the drug. And this is a control experiment. But we cannot do it on hurricane in a weather modification because every cloud system is different than another cloud system because of the natural variability of the weather, okay? You modify the weather and you don't know if it happened because of natural variability or because of your attempt to modify the weather.
And I'm going to play the devil's advocate here for a second. I want to go back to you were talking about no control and how do you know that what is being done is being impacted by this and not by the natural variability of what's going on in the atmosphere.
What is the cause and effect? Nobody can know what is the cause and effect.
So when you said that, my mind went to climate change, because I often hear people say that about climate change. How do we know, if we don't have a control, that this is what's happening because of what we're doing and not because of what's naturally going to happen anyway?
Okay, so when I say control experiment, it could be control observation, not necessarily experiment. So if we see that, I don't know, 500,000 years ago, there was a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we can find this. And at that time, there was global warming. And then another time, 50,000 years ago, the same. And another time, 10,000 years ago. Then, based on the observation, we can conclude that there is a cause and effect in increasing carbon dioxide in the air, and that cause global warming. So it's not necessarily just control experiment. It can be based on observation.
So you spent a long time doing this, and you're no longer doing this. Tell me, like, mentally where you're at now with all of those years that you spent trying to modify hurricanes.
I'm saying that it's hopeless. It's hopeless. The only solution is to build better standard, and not to allow insurance for building near the shore. That is the only solution. And of course, good evacuation plan. But there is nothing could be done about hurricane. You must understand that hurricanes start as tropical storm. Only 1 in 10 tropical storm become hurricane. And tropical storms are beneficial. They bring rain to the southeast and actually some to the southwest. So they are beneficial. So we cannot address tropical storms start in the East Africa. We cannot address it from there, So there were a proposal to cool the ocean, like the Norwegian plan that is described in the Washington Post and in Japan. I can go on and on. But you cannot cool the entire ocean. Let's assume that you cool a strip of part of the ocean. First of all, you don't know if the next hurricane would go over that patch of cold water. Secondly, even if it go over, that patch would be, I don't know, a few miles, 10 of a mile wide. But the hurricane advances at a velocity of about 10 miles per hour. So it will go over this cold water patch in an hour or two. And that's it. And the hurricane would continue to intensify after that. Sometimes the hurricane go over land, like in Florida, and then come from the other side of Florida and then intensify again, over hot water. So it's absurd what the Norwegian tried to do. The Japanese is even more absurd. They try to harvest energy from the hurricane. Yes, the power of hurricane is high, extremely high. As I said, like the power of the entire power plant of the world. But it's not energy. Energy is power multiplied by time. So what are you going to create a power plant which would work only for 2 or 3 hours a year on a single hurricane? It's absurd. And then what? Are you going to drag the power plant with a hurricane? It's absurd.
Can we modify the intensity of hurricanes by reducing carbon emissions?
No.
So nothing we do to reduce emissions is going to help with the change in the intensity.
Okay, there are some, I don't know if I say speculation or theories that global warming cause in intensification of hurricane. But if you are going to do something about global warming and about carbon dioxide, it will be for global warming. And then byproduct, it will or will not affect the hurricane. But you're not going to do this just for the hurricane, because the problem of global warming is much, much bigger than the problem of hurricane.
Gotcha. But it could be a byproduct.
Yeah, but it's a small it's a small byproduct in comparison to the huge problem of global warming.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes publish every Tuesday. Also, follow the National Weather Desk on all social media platforms to make sure you are getting credible weather information. Know your source and trust the experts. If you liked today's show, please share it with a friend and make sure you check out our other episode about weather modification. Thank you to Dr. Hugh Willoughby and Moshe Alamaro for sharing their expertise today. Also to Ed Piotrowski from WPDE in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, for joining me at the beginning of the episode. Ed is a great source of trustworthy weather information online and on air. As always, a special thanks to my associate producer, Brian Petrus. For the National Weather Desk, I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.